Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around for GoLocal Live here on Thursday afternoon in downtown Providence. Would like to thank Dwayne Gosley coming in from the Providence Gay Flag Football League, getting a sponsorship from the New England Patriots. Keeping things in New England, I'm happy to welcome on Professor Joel Tickner at UMass Lowell, Professor of Public Health. Joel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I appreciate getting your perspective as an internationally respected expert on chemicals and safe alternatives, because this is a unique look as to vaping and the toxins that could potentially be an issue and part of this big debate that we're having, and as we've seen, major public policy implications this week. So we'll let you introduce yourself a little bit as to what your line of research really looks at and how it potentially takes a look at looking at the vape debate that's taking place right now.
Great. Well, my research looks particularly at the dangers, the health implications of chemical exposures, but more importantly, I'm interested in looking at what are the better alternatives, the safer alternatives that meet a particular function in a particular product. In the case of e-cigarettes, that function is flavor, the question is that flavor even necessary?
And so to talk a little bit about that, a lot of research shows kind of two sides, many sides, saying it's safe, it's not safe. But you talk specifically about that flavor component. Break that down a little bit for us as to what you've looked at from the research perspective and what you have found.
Right, so I'll look at it from a broad perspective. Essentially, an e-cigarette is a series of liquids that then are volatilized with a heat source. You inhale them as an aerosol. So you have nicotine, you have flavorings, and then you have other propellant chemicals that create that aerosol that you inhale. Those flavorings obviously are to make the mixture taste not like a bunch of chemicals. And those flavorings, as we know, are very attractive to children, like bubblegum, banana, popcorn, caramel corn. Well, those flavorings also are very toxic when you inhale them. Now, the FDA considers those flavorings to be generally recognized as safe, but for when we ingest them in food. When you heat them up and you inhale them, it becomes a very different story. They get deep into the lungs, and they're very reactive, and they're very caustic chemicals. So when they get in our lungs, they can actually cause significant damage. One of those chemicals called diacetyl, which is an ingredient in artificial butter flavoring, actually led in and recognized as safe by the FDA. So you would buy your microwave popcorn and eat it. But the workers working with that chemical in the microwave popcorn facility actually incurred a disease called bronchiolitis obliterans. Essentially, this chemical was so caustic, it obliterated their bronchioles, leading to 8 workers needing double lung transplants. So we're essentially volatilizing chemicals that we don't know how toxic they can be when we actually ingest them. And if it's a child or a young adult, their lungs and their bodies are still growing. They breathe more per pound body weight than an adult, so they're actually getting a higher exposure than an adult as well.
So obviously the last few weeks, the national news has clearly been focused on vaping and vape deaths that we've seen, and also the public policy response to that as well. A lot of questions swirling around, what's leading to these deaths. Do you think that we'll get a concrete answer anytime soon?
Well, the aerosol that is coming out of an e-cigarette is a complex mix of chemicals, right? So some of them are products of combusting different chemicals. Some of them are the flavoring. So being able to parse those aspects of that aerosol apart and say this is the indicator. Like some are saying it's the THC in some of the vaping products. We just don't know. What we do know is that mixture, when you inhale it, can be caustic to the lungs. Now, we know also that certain chemicals are lower in their exposure in e-cigarettes than, for example, in a traditional cigarette. But there was research that came out a few days ago showing that some of the mint oil compounds that you would see in a menthol cigarette, for example, are significantly higher, up to 1,000 times higher in an e-cigarette vapor aerosol than in what comes out of a cigarette.
So let's talk a little bit about the marketing that's gone behind e-cigarettes, and obviously coming under fire, we saw the Juul CEO step down. Clearly, e-cigarettes were positioning themselves as being a safer alternative to traditional tobacco use. Where do we find ourselves now in September 2019 in the midst of this debate, in the midst of this competing research about what's safe and what's not?
All right. Well, let's start with the tobacco industry is not heavily regulated in this country, and it never has, and it's always fought, as we know, with what we've called in public health tobacco science to demonstrate that it's safe. And 20 years ago, before Congress testifying that cigarettes didn't cause problems, and then it was about secondhand smoke. So this is an opportunity for the public health community to get ahead of e-cigarettes. They were slow to act on tobacco, and getting ahead of the game right now. These incidents, these cases and deaths from inhaling e-cigarettes are just the tip of the iceberg, right? We're trying to address what is a potential future problem of addiction to nicotine in children. We're addressing what could be a problem of severe lung disease, and we're tackling it early on rather than waiting until there is severe opposition to it. So I applaud the public health community, for example, Governor Charlie Baker, for taking aggressive action. This is unprecedented action against an industry to say, as of today, you can't sell your products in the state of Massachusetts. And what that's going to do is force that industry to the table to say, hey, no more getting unregulated. You are going to come to the table and you're going to work with us to find a solution that keeps kids from getting addicted to e-cigarettes, that keeps them safe for consumers, because there's equivocal evidence that they do have a public health benefit, that they're better than smoking a traditional cigarette, and they may be a good substitute for those who are regular cigarette smokers. So this is a good opportunity to not just deal with the flavorings, but to deal with the whole industry.
And so, as you mentioned, up in Massachusetts, Governor Baker, with that wholesale moratorium on vaping products up there for 4 months. Here in Rhode Island, yesterday, Governor Gina Raimondo announced a 120-day moratorium on the sales of flavored products. So, as you said, this is really that opportunity for states, for stakeholders, as you said, to bring folks to the table to say this needs to be regulated. And as we chatted about before the show, you're a professor, you're in this world, you've seen what's happened. What needs to be done now that this breather has been placed on this, and public health officials, elected officials, are now de facto in the driver's seat about how to make this, how to look at this industry moving forward?
Right. Well, one of the challenges here is that this should be regulated as a federal issue, and whether the FDA acts on it is another question, and whether states can actually legislate on e-cigarettes is another question, whether they're preempted under the FDA, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act from actually regulating. So what Governor Baker did was issue an emergency public health declaration, which is legal under law to address an urgent public health concern that isn't being addressed right now. So as the states go to look at legislative or regulatory options for e-cigarettes, they may actually find problems with their efforts being preempted by federal policy. So the ideal situation is not to have 50 states with different policies, but to have a very strong federal policy that regulates this industry.
And so let's talk about these moratoriums. Of course, we see what happens anytime something is prohibited. Do we anticipate still seeing folks using their e-cigarettes on the street? Is there a black market still around? Is there a go-around for folks who are trying to look for product? Do you think that it might not completely, obviously, stop folks from using in the near future?
Well, there's a couple issues. Obviously, enforcement. It's easy to enforce, relatively easy to enforce a brick and mortar establishment. So the Mass Department of Public Health has put out guidance to local boards of health on enforcement and how they should be enforcing the moratorium. E-commerce is much more difficult to enforce a moratorium on. Obviously, someone, in the argument, I'm sure will be made that people will just go to New Hampshire and buy their e-cigarettes in New Hampshire. So moratoriums are a starting point. Doing it at a state level is not as effective as doing it at a federal level. But again, it opens up the space to have a conversation and not wait until a ticking time bomb explodes.
And so here in Rhode Island, obviously the governor focusing on those flavored cigarettes. As you said, that's really your concern, especially in terms of its enticement to youngsters, because as we know, it's illegal to sell to children under the age of 18, but they do get their hands on them, and there are very enticing flavors that, they want to try and they see their friends try. Do you anticipate there's any way to address that component of it? Again, now that we're looking at the moratorium here in Rhode Island and moving forward, if this is, one of the areas of your focus and concern, will the states be able to address this?
Well, I think, yes, that might be easier, though that is a federal issue again. But going back to the chemistry, right, flavorings are very complex chemistry and often can be quite toxic chemistry. And as I mentioned, there's a difference between ingesting a flavoring and inhaling a flavoring. So imagine you're putting yourself next to your bottle of air freshener and sticking it in your mouth and spraying it there, right? So this is, it gets deep into your lungs, you're inhaling it, and you're inhaling it regularly. So we just don't know what the health implications of this are. Whether it's the flavorings, the nicotine, the other chemicals, the propellants in the e-cigarette, or a combination of all of those together that's causing the health effects, we still don't know for sure. But we do know that chemistry of flavorings can be quite problematic when you're inhaling it. So it's a good place to start. And given that that's the attracting feature for young people, at least that might address the short term of health effects and attraction to young people.
And let's just talk finally, while I have you here, Professor, about this label of the public health emergency been placed on this. Obviously, we know the number of deaths that are caused by smoking, traditional smoking a year, are exponentially greater. Is it warranted to be placing such an emphasis when between the opioid crisis, between deaths by regular cigarette use alone? Is it a public health crisis?
Well, our governor, Governor Deval Patrick, about 7 years ago, issued a public health emergency on opioids, actually restricting the use of one opioid in the state, and that was unfortunately overturned by the courts because the FDA has authority on regulation, and FDA said that drug was safe and effective. However, you raise a good question, right? I mean, the tobacco still kills more people than of any other public health problem we have in Massachusetts, for example. But this is an opportunity using the visibility of the problem to act now, right? That's often what happens, right? These impacts are immediate versus tobacco impacts are long-term. Cancer, emphysema, lung disease are not immediate impacts. So often it takes something very immediate for us to act on things. This is just the nature of, unfortunately, our human nature, that we tend to act on plane crashes, right? A lot less people die in plane crashes than they die of cancer from exposure to whatever. But we act on that because it's immediate, we see it, and it has implications. So whatever it took, it's an opportunity to engage and look at both short-term and long-term implications.
Well, Professor, I appreciate your taking the time to Skype in here and give us a kind of a snapshot as to what you look at from an academic standpoint, specifically as it pertains to those toxins and what that means for e-cigarettes, vaping, and obviously what we're seeing in the national discourse and debate. So Professor Joel Tickner at UMass Lowell, thank you so much for taking the time to Skype in today.
Thank you.
Okay,
Have a good day.
thanks. We're going to let the
Bye.
professor go here, and that just about wraps up another day here on GoLocal Live in downtown Providence. We'll be back tomorrow morning with Smart Health with the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University and more. But of course, find us on GoLocalProv.com throughout the evening and GoLocalProv on Facebook. And we'll see you tomorrow. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.